All right, now let's take a look at those figures. I mean, try to break things down and try to understand it. We have a guest here in the studio, and of course, we have another one who will be joining us on the line all the way. Well, I shouldn't say all the way, it's actually from Lagos here, but from Victoria Island. In the studio, I have Mr. David Emezieke, who is a public affairs analyst, and then on the line from the island, that's Victoria Island now, we have Mr. Johnson Chukwu, who is the Managing Director of Cowrie Asset Management and Investment Bank. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Let me start with you, Mr. Chukwu. First, give me your general impression of the budget, 7.44 trillion naira. I mean, that's quite huge. I mean, higher, of course, than what we got last year.
Well, my take is that the budget, given the structure of the budget, is an improvement over what we had in the previous years. We have a capital expenditure budget about 30% of the total budget. The only concern with the budget is that the gradual encroachment of debt service in the overall budget estimate. We are now dealing with a debt service obligation that's about 24.7%, almost 25% of the total federal government budget. That's the only concern we have there. Otherwise, if you look at a proportion of 30% that the capital expenditure budget accounts for now, it will actually show you that we are beginning to show more seriousness. And at some point, we had capital expenditure budget less than 10%. So the next challenge will be the implementation of that budget. Given that the budget was just passed in May, I hope that the government will have the energy and the willpower to ensure that the budget is implemented, the capital budget is implemented.
Of course, I mean, you're absolutely right. Implementation is very key. And of course, as you said, you look at the amount of money we will be spending to service debts. That's quite huge. It's a huge concern. But we're going to be talking about the revenue very shortly. Let me just ask you to hold on there, and let me bring Mr. David here in the studio. Give me your general impression of the budget.
Well, generally speaking,
I mean, we can see the National Assembly decided to increase it by 143 billion, and of course giving, if you like, some very cogent reasons why it had to do so.
Yes, that would be maybe a sore point, a point I think the executive will have to scrutinize, because they also want to go through that line by line to see why it was necessary for them to increase it. But having said that, I could say the budget is very ambitious because it's targeted at growth and recovery. I have some concerns, though generally I can give, based on what the budget wants to achieve, I can say it's actually, if well pursued, it could bring it could go a long way to bringing us out of where we are now, to bringing activities. When they talk about something like social housing programs, special economic zone projects, and all that, you find that it's targeted at trying to create activity around the economy to bring us out of where we are. But just like my friend said, I have a concern. We look at the total budget and the amount of deficit budgeting, amount of money will be borrowed, which is over about 30%. It gives a cause for concern.
Yeah, so I mean, the budget deficit, of course, no doubt very high. What we're planning to borrow, 2.36 trillion naira. That's really huge.
It's quite high.
No doubt. Let me come back to you, Mr. Chukwu, and let's now begin to go into the particulars of this budget. First is, let's talk about the budget deficit that Mr. Emezieke has just talked about now. 2.36 trillion naira. That's quite huge. We understand it's about 2.18% to GDP. And, you look at the overall percentage itself, that's coming close to about 30-something% of the budget itself. That's quite huge. And then you also consider the fact that the government plans to borrow more domestically than it will do externally. That should also be a concern, right?
Yes, there are major concerns to us, particularly the domestic borrowing. The foreign borrowing, because the government said it's going to borrowing from concessionary sources, multilateral agencies and bilateral partners. We have the U.S. Exim Bank. Government is supposed to raise about $1 billion from that. You have the African Development Bank. Government is supposed to raise about $1 billion from that. And the government has raised about close to 1 billion from the Eurobond market. So if you look at those sources, their concessionary rate, apart from the Eurobond borrowing, which we got initially at 7.88%, but the funds coming from China Exim Bank will come at a concessionary rate. The concerns will be the domestic borrowing. If you look at the domestic debt market in the country today, you realize that today the private sector is borrowing about 30% because the government has succeeded in crowding out the private sector. And government borrowing has the unintended effect of crowding out the private sector. So even as we are pushing for economic recovery, you realize the private sector is lagging behind because they can't access credit. So that's the way the great concern is, because government, if you look at even government short-term borrowing instrument, treasury bills yield for 364-day instruments about 18.7, 18.8%. Effective yield is about 22%. And anybody who has to borrow, we have to pay a risk premium when you are borrowing to what the government is borrowing. That's where the concern is in terms of government borrowing.
Give me your own take on this issue of borrowing, because the government has clearly signified its intention to borrow heavy domestically, and no doubt that will have an effect on the private sector, as he said, crowd out the private sector. So it's certainly going to be a tough year for the private sector, looking at this budget.
Yeah, because for me,
even though things had always been tough for the private sector,
it's been tough.
Anyway, the cost of borrowing is high.
One would have thought that there'll be policies that will give us a breather, talking about the private sector. But for them to come in huge to borrow, it means not only they'll be crowded out, it also means there'll be squeeze of liquidity, because people are coming because they automatically, there is also a positive leaning towards borrowing from the government, because it's certain of payment and all that is certain. So the cost of that is not going to be, as it were, something that will, for me, it's like you want to create a reflect, and also at the same time want to squeeze. So I don't see the clear cut, because one would have expected that government will be spending now, but coming to borrow at the same time.
But let's tell ourselves the truth. If the government doesn't borrow, where does the government get the money to fund this budget? That huge deficit?
Somebody want to ask, because these monies we are borrowing, externally and internally, it's not as if it's like it's there. Just go take it. It's very costly to borrow.
Yeah, of course.
There are hidden charges, a lot of charges in the hard currency to go borrow abroad. And there are conditions.
Of course. I mean, as he said, as Johnson Chukwu said, of course, the loans we're getting abroad, they're mainly concessionary loans.
Yes.
We're borrowing from, bilateral bodies where the interest rate will be next to nothing.
But then, there are charges, there are costs.
But if we don't borrow, how do we fund the deficit?
I have always been, I've always favored a situation where you don't have to go too far, because this is too ambitious.
In other words, we should cut our coat according to our clothes.
You look at it, everything about this budget ought to be downsized. There are things I've expected the government to start to do, because I was excited when they came in last year with zero budgeting. That is an exciting thing.
It's still the same
You understand that. But when you go back with the zero budgeting, then all kinds of scandal came in last year. You understand that, pardon here and there, and all kinds of things. When you look at also, compare all the items, you now begin to ask yourself, what is zero budgeting? It's about go and find out the real cost of things,
but that's what
and seek ways to downsize.
That's what they've done in this case. So what you're saying is that the budget should not be this huge, right?
It should not be this huge, because there are still many things they needed not to have spent so much on.
Mr. Chukwu, let me come to you. Do you think we're just being overambitious here, that you look at the size of the budget itself, that it's just too much, and that, because whether you like it or not, there's just no other way I can think of now that we can fund this deficit without resorting to borrowing?
Okay, let me weigh in, DEJI. I think what we need to do is to review our economic development strategy. Today, Nigerian government cannot fund infrastructure development using the current model we have. No matter what size of budget deficit we want to create, we will not generate enough from borrowing to build the infrastructure we need to catalyze economic growth. We need to build first world infrastructure today. if we have to compete, if Nigeria has to move from a third world country to a first world country. A couple of countries have done that by building infrastructure. But unfortunately for us, we neither have a tax base nor the other sources of revenue from crude. I mean, we only produce at best 2.2 million barrels. The projection is that in the next 3 years we'll be producing 2.5 million barrels. That's an insignificant drop given the size of the economy. So what is lacking is that the government needs to change the strategy for funding infrastructure. And that should be that government should adopt a public-private partnership strategy to build infrastructure. There's no reason why the government should think of building the railroad from Lagos to Kano when the government can actually invite private sector, and private sector will build that and run it more efficiently. There's no reason why we shouldn't have a rail line that will run from here, from Lagos to the southeast of the country, if we have defined a corridor and define the appropriate fiscal and legal framework that will allow private sector to invest in infrastructure. The infrastructure gap we have today cannot be funded by government. And the earlier we recognize that, the better for us. So the problem is that we cannot continue to expand government borrowing, because if you look at the debt service obligation this year, like I said, it's about 24.7%. And it will increase next year because the current debt borrowing will reflect in the debt service obligation of next year. Then eventually get to a point where debt service will account for virtually all your recurrent expenditure.
Mezeke, let's look at the benchmark oil production now. 2.2 million barrels a day, that is what the benchmark is. Last year it was, I think, 2.2 million barrels.
But
at some point we were doing 1.2 million barrels because of the crisis in the Niger Delta. Even though that crisis has somewhat abated, we're not doing 2.2 as we speak. Well, the NNPC GMD some time ago, not quite long ago, told us we're doing somewhere around 2 million barrels. You think we'd be able to sustain 2.2? Because fact is that if we're not able to sustain it, that will definitely erode on the revenue we're expecting to fund this budget.
Yes, you're right. Anyway, I have concern. The concern I have, when I look at the budget, I feel that if the amount of votes to the Niger Delta Commission and to the Niger Delta, to the
amnesty program.
The amnesty program.
Of course, that was increased.
If actually is implemented, and if also the promises the acting president made when the president was in England, if those things are reviewed and implemented, we may have fairly conducive environment
in the Niger Delta.
Now, if that is the case, I think they will be able to do maybe something close to 2.2 million barrels.
But we should also not forget that as we speak today, what we're being told is that we are even exceeding our OPEC quota.
That's also a source of concern. Our OPEC quota is about
not up to 2 million.
Not up to 2 million. So it becomes very ambitious, as I said before. So if you are exceeding the budget, the quota, and you are targeting the switch above what is given to produce by OPEC, then how do we go about it?
Mr. Chukwu, let me just get your take on that.
Well, I think our OPEC quota is 2.2. What OPEC did was that they did not reduce Nigeria's production quota because of the losses we had suffered last year. It was Nigeria and Libya that they allowed to produce. Nigeria was allowed to produce up to 2.2 million barrels. So I don't think that's a problem. The challenge we have is whether we can manage our domestic issues to continue to produce up to 2.2 million barrels.
So in other words, there's hope. But let's look at the exchange rate. I mean, the benchmark exchange rate. Does it make sense to you at all that the government has decided to peg the exchange rate at 305 when we know that in reality, as a matter of fact, that rate has been overtaken by what we see in the market today, even at the interbank market level?
Well, you will recognize that government cannot contradict itself. The central bank has left the 305 to dollar as official rate, and as long as that is the official rate that central bank has maintained, the federal government, the fiscal authorities cannot come up with a rate different from that. If you recall, when the budget was initially presented, the executive presented the budget with a benchmark, an exchange rate of 285. And they had to go back to correct that because they cannot come at a rate that is different from the CBN official rate. And for now, yes, the parallel market is doing about 380, 385. But until we have a convergence of rates, one cannot expect the fiscal authorities to come up with a rate that is at variance with the rate that the central bank considers as official rate.
We know that you look at the parallel market rate far higher than that. You look at all the other windows that the central bank has created. The rates there are far higher than what we have here. Investors window, the rate for school fees and what have you. None of those rates, is 305.
Yes, I think the CBN are still working very hard to make sure that the disparity is actually shortened. So there is no, like as my colleague said, there is no reason why we should not actually. That was why the Parliament in its own wisdom also allowed that to fly. So I think we can work with it.
Okay, another issue I want us to talk about is the whole issue of taxation. No question at all. The government says it is trying to diversify its revenue base away from oil to tax. And of course, the Minister of Finance, Kemi Adeosun, spoke about that. I mean, when she talked about taxation when they had a town hall meeting recently to talk about the performance of this government. I want us to take a lesson now to what the minister said, and when we come back, I want to get your reaction.
6% is our tax to GDP ratio. It's one of the lowest in the world. Ghana's at 15, South Africa's at 24. Most of the countries we admire, that we go to and we like their infrastructure, their tax to GDP ratio is 30%. So we have a big job to do in getting the Nigerian people to understand we must pay taxes. When we all pay a little, we'll have enough money to do all the projects that we need to do without burdening future generations unnecessarily. And that really is going to be our priority going forward. Improving our revenues, blocking the leakages. A lot of money is leaking. A lot of agencies collect money and just spend it themselves without any real accountability. We're going to block those leakages. We see that there's a lot of revenue around government that we don't track properly. We're going to track it and direct it into the sectors where it's needed. It's looking a lot better than it did this time last year, and it's going to get better. Nigeria is coming out of the recession, and we're going to come out much stronger so that the 36 states all contribute, because every single state is viable. Every state has some form of viability. And we have the right type of young people, energetic people, entrepreneurial people. What government wasn't doing was supporting them with the right infrastructure and conditions, and that's what this.
Mr. Chukwu, let me come to you. I mean, there we had the minister saying our tax to GDP ratio is 6%, is among the lowest in the world, and that whether we like it or not, that has to go up, and that will be the next priority of the government, to focus on tax to ensure that the tax to GDP ratio at least, rises, that to get more Nigerians to pay tax. As a matter of fact, if more Nigerians were paying taxes, we would not be so reliant on what happens in the oil market, right?
Well, yes, to some extent, because the oil industry is really critical to our import earnings, our foreign exchange earnings. In terms of government revenue, oil and gas accounts for about 70% of government revenue and about 90% of total foreign exchange earnings. So head of tail, we still need the oil and gas sector until we diversify our export earnings. But back to the issue of tax. Ultimately, if we improve the tax revenue, the proportion of oil revenue to total revenue will decline from 70% at the federal level. And that, for me, is the way to go. Because in the first place, when people pay taxes, they have a higher stake at the affairs of the state. And they will also make sure that they compel the state to carry out its role, to play its role, to carry its assignments. And because of that disconnect today, when a lot of Nigerians don't pay tax, they don't feel a sense of duty to impose on the government the oversight role that the citizens are supposed to impose. But beyond that issue of citizens' supervision or oversight, we have to look at the government's ability to execute its projects. If we have an effective tax system, the government will engage in development so that it will continue to improve its tax revenue. In other countries of the world, if you go and set up a factory where there are no facilities, the government will be facilities to that factory so that it will employ people so the government can earn its revenue from taxes. Unfortunately, we have a very skewed system where the government does not depend on tax revenue. And today, the government's ability to carry out its activities is basically dependent on what it earns from crude oil income. And that is not sustainable.
Something has to happen with this tax issue. I mean, 6% to GDP, it's really poor.
It's really poor. It's to say the fact. It's very, very poor. Well, I think in this country we are not actually taking advantage of our population, because if you look at the population of Ghana and others, we still have a very large. So we are actually stifling the people that are in the
because from records, even Ghanaians pay taxes more than
everybody
we do.
pay tax. You understand that? Here we have traders are not paying tax, roadside people are not paying tax, but all these are taxable adults. So I think the tax base needs to be broadened to bring in people in the informal sector that are larger than the people that are in the formal sector. That is one. Two, also, she talked about, and it caught my attention about actually making sure that there are plugs of loopholes and leakages. Now, the National Assembly raised an alarm that up until today, that the expenses and the incomes of CBN hasn't been submitted.
Including some other
including NMPC.
NMPC.
You understand that? So if they are actually spending funds that are unappropriated for, it's actually illegal. So we find that we have incomes that are unaccounted for. So a company like NMPC, leakages that our lives, quote and unquote, depend on, we don't know how much they earn and how much they spend. CBN, we don't know how much they earn. And these are all wastages and leakages. So I expect that by now, this government, being the change government, should have shown a good example. So when we broaden the tax base and also make sure there's accountability, especially in our key revenue yielding MDAs, I think we'll do good.
Let's not also forget, and that is very crucial, that we must all remember that what we're talking about here, this is still a budget. It's not it's actually a budget. It's a proposal.
It's a proposal.
So we have a proposal on the table that looks good, but
the implementation,
it's a different thing when it comes to implementation.
Yes.
How worried are you when it comes to implementation, especially when you take cognizance of what we've had in the past? But just before you comment on that, I want us to take a lesson to the Minister of Power, Works and Housing, as well as the Minister of Budget and National Planning now, talking about the performance of last year's budget. Let's take a listen to them.
Through direct jobs in the power sector alone, there were 9,000 direct jobs. Indirect jobs in that sector were 60,000. In the works sector, the direct jobs were 17,749 and 52,000 indirect jobs. In the housing sector, there were 13,680 direct jobs and 41,040 indirect jobs. 542 local contractors were empowered during the period under review. Most importantly, I can tell you that we have now gained momentum, and it is impacting on the implementation of the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan launched by Mr. President. The consequence of this is that the macro indices that were negative, such as inflation, exchange rates, are turning back in the right direction. This is the result of construction of roads, power projects, and housing projects, and the micro impact on jobs, which is gradually increasing money in the economy and growing the purchasing power.
Of oil production in the Niger Delta last year created very serious additional revenue challenges. So in addition to low prices, we had low production. Nevertheless, we have been able to meet all our recurrent expenditure commitments, particularly the payments of salaries to federal civil servants. We've been able to meet all our debt service commitments, all our statutory transfer commitments. We have met all of them. We have also released about 1.2 trillion naira of the 2016 budget to finance capital projects and programs. This is an unparalleled in the history of Nigeria's budget performance. It's the highest release that this nation has achieved at a time of dwindling.
Mr. Chukwu, you heard that. I mean, it gives you a sense that it was, in terms of implementation, you know, last year's budget didn't do so badly. I mean, that the government, to a certain extent, especially if the government is now saying altogether it released 1.2 trillion naira for capital projects, and that it's been able to meet all of its commitments in terms of statutory transfer, recurrent expenditure, and all of that.
You see, for me, it's no big deal when the government meets its budgetary projections on recorded expenditure and statutory transfers. Those are that expenditures are incurred as a result of affliction of time. Because if you look at recorded expenditure, you're talking of overhead expenses, salaries and wages and all the rest. Statutory transfers are transfers to those agencies that are safe accounting, that are autonomous accounting-wise. So they are not proper measures of implementation of the budget. The cross of budget implementation, as far as I'm concerned, is the capital expenditure budget. And unfortunately for us, when the budget is not approved on time, you lose a critical time that is required to implement capital expenditure within the Nigerian environment, given our climatic conditions. If you look at Nigeria, for instance, the southern part of the country is in the rainforest zone. So you see heavy rain from the month of April to the month of October. So within that period of about 6 months to 7 months, you cannot engage in massive infrastructure development.
But I have to ask you this. I mean, let's tell ourselves the truth. You can only release the money that you have. You can't give what you don't have. So if the money doesn't come out, if the revenue doesn't come in early, how do you disburse the money early enough?
Well, interestingly, there's something that a lot of people have not looked at. Our budget deficit is 2.35 trillion. Is that right? Our capital expenditure budget is 2.17 trillion. So the capital expenditure budget is basically funded from deficit. We see on a monthly basis the government is raising money using the federal government bond instrument and the federal government treasury-based instrument. So the government can actually front-load its capital expenditure, its borrowing, so as to meet the capital expenditure. Because the reality of the matter is that if you have to do road network and you give out a road contract for 100 kilometers, you're not going to do it in a single day. You will need time to do that. So if the budget comes out middle of the year, you have lost half of the time you need to implement that budget.
What he's saying is actually true. We had the Minister of Budget and National Planning there saying 1.2 trillion has been released for capital projects. But of course, as Johnson Chukwu has been saying, timing is also key, because you haven't got the whole month and the year to work. So at what time where this money is released, and you know, the timing of the release too, it's key.
Yes, the timing is very key. And again, you look at it, in the light of the mass unemployment, I think the figures reeled out there by the Minister of Power and Housing and Works and Housing, it's like
Minister of National Budget.
Yeah,
okay, you mean okay?
No, the Fashola.
Of course,
it's like a drop.
It's a tiny, very tiny drop.
Mighty ocean, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at it, this is a practical. You look at Lagos State, for instance. You see that work is going on. You see the flyovers being commissioned. You see streets are
that is providing jobs.
Yeah, and we could relate with that. But can we really relate with roads are being constructed? I want to ask where and where. You understand that? Is it the Niger Bridge?
No, but roads are being constructed anyway. We know
but,
that.
But it's still like a tiny, you understand that in terms of the quantum what we need. And then again, like you said, it's only in the dressing that this works go. In the rest it does not go. So if funds are not available at the right time. But like you rightly pointed out right now, we have 1 billion from Eurobonds, ADB.
So we should begin to use that.
So why can't we start to release right now?
Finally, gentlemen, let me start with you, Mr. Chukwu, on a final note now. In terms of implementation, what are your fears or concerns, so to speak?
Well, my concern remains that the capital expenditure budget may not be fully implemented because of the timing of the budget approval. And then you also have to contend with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, what we call the due process law, that imposes some bottlenecks to release of funds that requires certain conditionalities to be met in terms of public bids and or what have you, that slows down the process of release of funds. We may need to look at that law again and possibly see how to tweak it to be in tandem with the needs of the country without compromising the purpose of establishing that law. I think it will be a tall order to have 100% implementation of the capital expenditure budget, unless the budget will still be extended to May next year.
Mr. Emezeke, what's your own take on the issue of implementation?
Well, we have never had it very good in this country based on our history. So, as it were, since the government have set up mechanisms, have assured, it's good to actually look, but I have concerns. Where I have concerns about how to finance the deficit, about capital expenditure and all that. I have concerns that these things at the end of the day may not be followed through. So, and if they're not followed through, the impact in the economy will not be felt. So those are my concerns on the position.
Well, let's just hope those concerns
but let's hope those concerns are there. I have positives.
Are addressed, yeah.
There are positives I have.
Yeah.
The issue of social housing program.
Quite good.
If it is pursued conclusively, we will feel the impact. I also like the special economic zone projects. That about 50 billion naira will be released out there, and it will set up to encourage manufacturing and exports. I also like the economic expansion grant. You know, that's targeted at tax credits reduction. And also, I like where the Bank of Industry has been recapitalized, and also Bank of Agriculture. So with this, I feel that the micro, small scale and medium scale enterprises will be encouraged.
And it's also good something is going to the Niger, something substantial.
Yes,
it's going to the Niger Delta.
To the Niger Delta, so the environment, we can sleep.
Yes, we can sleep. And most importantly, we want development in that region.
In that region. And I think the government has done the right part.
All right.
Yes,
gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for coming on the program. Thank you very much for your contributions. Let's just hope this budget is implemented to the letter, and of course, if that happens, it will be better for Nigeria. But most importantly, fact is that the government cannot continue on its own to fund infrastructure development in this country. Whether we like it or not, the private sector has to be heavily involved so that the government can concentrate on other areas now. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll be looking at the budgets of the state, because all the while we've been talking about the federal budget. But what about the states? All the 36 states in this country actually have their own budget, and you put that together, is quite substantial. So imagine what would happen if all the entire states in this country were to implement their budgets to the letter. It means the country will not remain the same again. That's what we'll be talking about next. Stay with us. Every day, every hour, and every minute, news break in Nigeria. Things happen so fast, it's most times difficult to track and comprehend them. But that's what we do right here on DEJI360. 2015, would you want to come back again?
It's like asking Jesus Christ if he knew he was going to die, will you want to come back as the savior of the world again?
We do not just help you track the stories, we break them down, explore all the angles, analyze the issues so that you can fully comprehend the stories and use them to make the right decisions.